Hey, welcome back everybody to my class, Advanced Programming Concepts using C++. Today we're going to talk about processing array contents. I know it doesn't look very good in terms of the handwriting, but hopefully I'm pronouncing it so. Okay, so basically what I want to just go over is review how to process contents in an array. And we've learned about the range-based loop. And I think it's important that we understand that we can iterate through an array and do some calculations. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples and then maybe give you a couple ideas of how to approach certain problems. So here's a problem where we want to find the pay rate of a of certain employees. Okay, so and we're going to add on to this. So we're going to kind of do just a simple case, and then we'll add on to it just so we understand how to process things in an array. So the use case here is we want to see how much money each employee makes. Okay. So in this case, we have an array that we want to populate with hours. In this case, size is 5, so we're only going to use 5. Usually, obviously, you're going to have more elements in an array. And your for range loop will iterate through these elements in the array. But we can't do anything in the array until we have our values. So what we have on lines 9 through 13 is a prompt for the user to populate the array with data. Now, usually this is going to come from a file or some other type of data source. Usually, not all the time it's going to come from input. We're using input just so you understand what's happening, but for the most part, as we continue through this course, we're going to actually do some file processing from cin. We're using the range-based loop. If you don't know what that is, you can take a look at the video before this and get yourself up to speed. So in this simple case is we're going to enter hours, and then after we enter hours, we're going to so after lines 9 through 13, the array will be populated with some values, hourly values. Then I'm just showing you how we want to get the rate of one element. So I just picked an arbitrary one. So if we do the index or subscript of 1, we're actually going to just multiply that value times the rate, right? And then we're setting that to pay. So let's do that first. And then I can show you visually how that looks. So we'll do 20, 10, 23, 40, and 25. Okay. Now if we look, so this data is already in our array after lines 9 through 13. And then numbers of element 1 would be this 10 here. We're multiplying 10 times the rate, and the rate is 2050, so that gives you $205. So that's pretty much his pay. Now let's take a closer look as to what the heck is going on here, okay? So let's take this, and we can just kind of shove this aside. Okay, so when we're looking at these lines here, what we're really doing is we're filling up the array with some values. So in my case, what we did is we did 20, 10, 23, and then 40 and 25, right? So again, we talked about how we populated this. IDX is your iterator that's going through with this loop right here, right? Now, when we say numbers of 1, we got to label this numbers. So numbers of 1 is which element here. So we take the subscript, and we know that this is that. So this actually is going to represent the value 10. Hence, this really is 10 times, and then the rate is $20.50. And that's how we get the $250. Okay. Now, let's take that a step further, because right now we're only finding the rate for one individual record. What if we wanted to find the rate for multiple records? For multiple records. So I'll give you a second to think about that. You can pause the video now and then you can wait. But basically, to find the rate for every single record, we need a for loop, right? There's no other way. Unless you write out every single, we're going to write out 5 paste statements, but that doesn't make sense, because if you had 100 elements in an array, you're not going to write 100 paste statements, C++ statements, right? So let's set this up, okay, pseudocode wise. So why don't we do our for range loop where we don't need a reference variable because we're not populating the array. We can just say h or hour for numbers, right? So we're going to iterate through that. And then we can just take this and say pay is equal to hour times rate. Okay? And then we'll do this thing in here for each individual one. Okay, I think it's much easier and understandable to do a for range base loop initially instead of using the subscript syntax. And you'll see me switch back and forth. Okay, so let's go here. So we're going to say that this is our initial baby example, and now we're grown-ups. So we can say that this is int hour, and then numbers. We're going to take this. It's perfectly fine. And we'll say pay is equal to hour times rate, right? So by doing that, now I can find in each individual rate and print it out. So let's try that. Extend this a little bit more. So we do 10, 20, 30, 40, and then we'll do 42 hours. So here's the rate for each individual element. $205, $410, $615, $820, and $861, right? Very, very easy. Visually, right? Basically, we're iterating through, and we're going to multiply this times rate. Then, again, we're always going forward. This times rate, this times rate as we move forward, and so on. All right? Perfect. Perfect. Now, suppose that we also have, and we'll just so we can add to this problem, we also have an array that, or a record of employees, right? So basically what we're going to have is, we're going to have Jim, Steve, Jim, Steve, Michelle, and John, and Lucy. Jim worked the 20 hours, Steve worked 30, Michelle worked 40, John worked 10, and Lucy worked 38 hours. Okay, so now we're getting into the point of a record structure where you have name, and then you have the hours worked, right? We're still going to assume that the user is going to type in the hours worked, but we want to have the ability to store these two things in arrays. Okay? Now you can't store these two things in one array because an array has to have a data type. And in this case, the data type of this column is most likely is going to be a string. And the data type of this column is going to be, we can say, an int, right? Hence, we cannot use one array to hold both, right? But we could hold two arrays, right? We'll hold this array that has names 2, 3, 4, and then we'll hold another array that has the hours worked, right? And the data type here is going to be a string, and the data type here is going to be an int. Now, how do we hold and store all these things at the same time? That's very, very easy. And then here we're gonna be forced to use a long for loop. I'm gonna call it a long for loop. That's not the technical name, but I'm just gonna call it a traditional long for loop. We can't use a range loop, but what we could do is we could use a long for loop. Because if I access the 0th index in my string array, at the same time I could also access the 0th index in my int array. So for example, let's say that I'm writing a for loop here where I start at 0, right? I'm going to end up in size. When I is 0, it's 0 for both, right? There's really no mix and match. 0 is a 0, so you're at the 0th index for both. And if you're at the 0th index for both, then the only thing that really has to change is the name of your array. So if I had an array for names of 0 indicates this, and hours of 0 indicates this. So now that we've got that settled, and we know that the subscript of 0 represents both of them, all we really have to do is switch up the names of the array, right? So now what we could do is we can do the following. We can take, we're going to take this out. Actually, we can keep this. No, we'll take this out. Take this out. Comment this out. And we are going to, we'll just say hours, and we'll say string names. Now, in order for me to use a string data type, I have to include what library? The string library. So now what we have here is we have our for loop that we're constructing, normal for loop. And remember, when we're at the 0th index, we're gonna just switch up the array names. So here's names. Well, not switch, but list them, right? So if they had another column, maybe you had, I don't know, their ID number, you'd have another array that would represent the ID. And then you can just use the same index as you loop through. Okay, so we populate the array this way. Okay, and then we can now compute the pay, right? So if I do this, and take this code. So a lot of this stuff is copy and paste. So I hope you've started to learn and get the hang of that. We're not going to write this out. We're actually going to take the hours of I, right? Because what we're doing is we're going to, once we fill up the array, we're going to iterate through it again. and we are going to multiply the hours times the rate. Now, I could have done this all in one loop, but I just wanted to show you and break it down separately so you understand what it takes to process the contents of an array. So in this case, I'm also going to write the person's name. So we'll do this. Because this is a sticky operator, I'm actually going to do it outside, because we don't have to keep resetting it. So we can say employee name, and then the employee name would be names of I, right? So now let's run this real quick. So we'll do, we'll do Jim, Steve, Michelle, John, and Lucy. Jim, Steve, Michelle, John, and Lucy. So here we have now the employee name along with the employee's rate. And we loop through each one using our one iterator here, which is our index I. So that's one example of how to process contents in an array. You have to go one by one, and you can store multiple items in a file, like in a type of column format. So if you have more than one data point, you can read the data into one array. So a couple of steps here that you have to understand is get the data into a column, like a visual column, and then agree on the actual data type of that column. So in this case, we agreed that the data type of the first column is a string, and then we agreed that the second column is an int, right? If there was a third column, then we'd probably want to do whatever would make sense. So if you had an ID number, maybe you'd want to do a string, because some ID numbers have alphanumeric characters. So it all depends on the use case, but that's basically how you would break it down in terms of conducting some type of processing in the array. The last thing is we can add on to this, okay, is what if we wanted to add the total hours in the array, in total hours worked by all employees. Okay, total hours worked. So if I wanted to do that, okay, I can do it pretty much in this loop. I'd just have to declare an additional int that will represent my total hours, right? So total hours equals 0. And now that we're going through the array one by one by this index here, what I could do is I could say total hours is equal to total hours plus hours of I. Right, and then I want to print the total hours worked outside of my for loop, because you don't want to keep printing it inside the for loop. So total hours worked, std, no, we could just do total hours, and then do that. So what I'm doing here is I'm using an accumulator strategy, where this will now have the additional hours, the previous hours that we had. So visually, okay, let's take a look real quick. So we have 10, oh, I'm sorry, wrong array. We have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, right? So initially total hours is 0. Okay, on the first time around, we're going to add total hours plus index of 0, right? Which is what our code says, because this is I is 0, right? So total hours becomes 10. We move to the next one, and we're going to add total hours, which we just changed from from 0 to 10. 10 plus wherever we're at. Where are we at? We're at the first element. So this becomes 30. 10 plus 20 is 30. Then we move on to the next one. Total hours now is 30 because of this assignment, right? So 30 plus 40, you 60, right? We move on to the next. And then 60 plus 40, 100. And then we move to the next. So this is what we call an accumulator, where you accumulate the value for a total. So usually when you want to do some type of totaling, you would use an accumulator this way. So let's take a look, and we can add on to this. So we'll do some names here. 10, John 30, Steve 40, Lucy 38, and Mildred 39. So we iterated through the array, we found the total, but remember, we're not printing the total until we're out of the loop, because then this would print every time inside the loop. Okay? Okay, so hopefully this gave you a starting point and strategy on how to approach processing array contents. On the next video, I am going to show you how to loop through parallel arrays. And actually, we're actually doing a little bit of it here. We're looping through parallel arrays here, okay, using the same index. But stay tuned. I'll see you on the next video.